Hi all, thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. We are grateful to be having Milton Koch from Buchanan Ingersoll and Rooney to join us for this webinar. As a certified public accountant and a former analyst at the U.S. Department of Commerce, he supports trade litigation clients by developing legal strategies based on in-depth analysis of complex financial data. He has taken a primary role in numerous trade cases, providing creative and novel legal solutions to address issues ranging from the business structure of multinational companies to unique subsidy schemes of foreign governments. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Lydia. So today I'm going to provide a quick 101 on the basics of tariffs. And from there, I will also touch on the Section 232 investigation that has started and the Section 301 tariffs that are already in place for medical equipment and PPE coming from China. So to be very clear, the Section 232 investigation that started just last week. The Section 301 I'm talking about, that's from 2018, but in 2024, when President Biden updated and renewed the tariffs, he added several pieces of PPE to the list for tariffs. All right, so let's get right into it. What is a tariff? I have the dictionary definition up here on the board on the slide, but there's really two components to it. One is that there's some sort of tax or fee that's charged by the government. And then two, that it's done either to collect revenue or for policy reasons. And what we're seeing right now is a lot more of tariffs being done for policy reasons than to collect revenue necessarily. All right, so then the next piece is, how is it organized? Well, they use a system called the Harmonized Tariff Schedule, HTS for short. And it's a classification system just like the Dewey Decimal System you'd see at the library. It's standardized globally at the 6-digit level. But in the US, we actually go up to 10 digits here. Now, for most tariffs, customs will just say outright, okay, it's great that you're entering this product. Tell me what the HTS code is, and I'll go ahead and tell you what the tariff is that you owe. We'll calculate it off of that instead. Now, they care about more about the code than they do about the product or the part itself necessarily. So just as an example of how a little bit odd it can get with the HTS codes, parts of hearing aids and pacemakers actually fall under the same category at the 6-digit level of 902190 for other orthopedic appliances. It's only at that 10-digit level that they start to break out and differentiate between pacemakers and hearing aids. And last but not least, there's also the importer of record. That is the individual or business that's bringing the shipment through customs. And so as a result of that, that entity is always responsible for not just doing all the legal paperwork and having the legal compliance done correctly, but they also are responsible for paying all the tariffs owed. All right, so there's, at a high level, there's really kind of two tariffs that are there. One is the baseline tariff rate, and this is done by Congress. They change it from time to time. They'll update it periodically, but it's done mainly with the goal of collecting revenue. Most of the HTS codes, I'll be honest, are usually at a baseline rate of 0. That example I just gave of hearing aids versus pacemakers, most of those have an HTS. Those HTS codes don't have a different tariff rate. It's at 0 for both of them for the baseline. Right? And then now what we're seeing a lot more of are what I like to call the trade policy tariffs. So I'll take this in reverse order. Down here at the bottom, we've got International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA tariffs. You've probably heard of these recently. These are the reciprocal tariffs that have been in effect since April. Anti-dumping and countervailing duties, as Lydia mentioned, that's kind of what I do mainly, is helping out with trade investigations, but that's not directly relevant for today. Section 301, which is tariff investigations by the U.S. Trade Representative Office. This is kind of known as the might makes right, and USTR uses this in a lot of different ways. So for example, for right now, there is an investigation that just has been started into Brazil to see if it's appropriate to have tariffs on them based on some of the things that are going on there. I'm going to be talking about the ones that are going on for China, for intellectual property theft. Those tariffs started in 2018, but they were updated again last year by President Biden. And then finally, that brings us to the main focus of today's presentation, which is the Section 232. These are national security investigations done by the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Department of Commerce. And right now, they're what's being used the most by the Trump administration. The tariff rates can be changed once the investigation is completed, largely at the president's discretion. For example, this summer, we saw steel and aluminum tariffs go from 25% to 50%. However, because they are also national security based, that makes them a lot harder to challenge, whether it be at the WTO or elsewhere. And they cover imports from all countries. They're not limited to specific ones. So last week, there was a new investigation announced into medical devices, personal protective equipment, medical consumables, and other medical equipment. It was announced September 26th, with an initiation date of September 2nd. Now, traditionally, the Bureau of Industry and Security will have 270 days to do a thorough investigation. And they'll provide a report to the president with a bunch of different recommendations of actions that can be taken. And the president will basically pick from a menu and decide which ones he thinks are appropriate to do. Now, what we're seeing right now is instead it's taking closer to about 6 months. So, for example, copper and pharmaceuticals investigations, Section 232 investigations started with those in March and April each. The copper one completed in August. There's now a 50% tariff in effect on imports of copper and copper products. And there's been a few Truth Social posts recently in the last week or so indicating that pharma tariffs will be announced soon. So again, 6 months is more likely, but it can be up to 9 months, that 270-day mark. So based on this, what we're expecting is tariffs will be announced sometime in spring 2026, likely in that window of March to May. Right now, there is no public hearing planned. The announcement that went out last week starting this investigation did ask for comments from the public by October 17th, 2025. Now, comments can be filed confidentially, and we have helped clients do so in many of the other Section 232 investigations. I will note, however, that October 17th date is not exactly set in stone. If there does happen to be a government shutdown and it does last long enough, the comment period might change or shift in some ways. So what is the scope of this investigation? What are they actually looking at? Nothing is outright defined in the announcement. They just give some different examples here, and I have it up here on the slideshow for you to see. But it is kind of useful to see, and I think it is one of these things where if you do provide comments, you do have the opportunity to help define what some of these terms are or help guide where the investigation will focus on and what might be included within the scope of Section 232 tariffs. So just starting with PPE, I think we're all kind of remember the shortages throughout the pandemic, whether it be for masks, gloves, or hand sanitizer, right? Well, so in 2023, the Department of Defense actually issued a report called the Biodefense Posture Review, which highlighted there was a national security risk due to U.S. dependency on imports, and recommended creating stockpiles of PPE and increasing U.S. manufacturing of not just PPE, but also other things like APIs. Medical consumables. I think this is relatively straightforward. These are ones that are like scalpels or syringes that are kind of designed to be used for single use. They did note here that there is a separate Section 232 going on for pharmaceuticals. So prescription drugs or other types of drugs, they're not going to be covered by the scope of this investigation. That's part of the one that's already ongoing. Medical equipment and medical devices. Honestly, this is where I think would be the area of focus for members of CTEL. Telemedicine is going to be relying on devices that are used for diagnosing, monitoring, or treating medical conditions. And it also could generally be considered tools and machines. Again, these terms are not well defined at this point. We just have a few examples that they've given. I'd point out that a hospital bed could be used for telemedicine as well, right? Now, in the notice itself, the Bureau of Industry and Security did say that there are a dozen criteria they are requesting comments on. So please note that These factors can all be tailored to your specific area of interest based on the company that you're with. And the comments don't necessarily have to follow these guidelines. This is just the factors that they are suggesting they want comments on. However, I think this will be the one and likely only window to comment for this investigation, full stop. So for the first 4 factors here, this is BIS trying to get a sense of the specific sub-markets for each medical device that they are looking at. So here they have the first one, they're asking what is demand. The second is saying what is US production and supply. The third is saying, can you tell us what is foreign supply chain? And then 4 is kind of, let's combine all this information together. What % of the supply chain is foreign? What % of the supply chain is domestic, right? The next 2 criteria here are getting a little bit more specific and seem to be geared more at US manufacturers. And they're looking to get at whether foreign manufacturers are able to sell into the US market at unfair prices. And it could be that they're unfairly low prices because they received a subsidy, or it could just be because they're selling below cost and they've got too much production now after the pandemic. That's not getting into the why isn't necessarily the focus of the investigation. It's more to understand what are people seeing in the marketplace, what are problems that are affecting the US economy and producers of medical equipment here. The next set of factors, these are more aimed at what I call the national security factors. So take this first one, for example, export controls. This was something that was used by China for critical minerals and was a big deal in the spring. Without a steady supply of critical minerals coming from China, several factories were at risk of shutting down, particularly when I believe it was the rare earth magnets were threatened to be withheld from the US. As a result, the US kind of struck a deal with China, at least pausing the reciprocal tariffs. It seems like negotiations are still going on there for a trade deal. And the DoD also took steps to invest in the Mountain Pass mine and help rebuild the US supply chain of critical minerals. Now, these other factors here are basically looking at what can we do to increase US production? What's the impact of the current trade policies? Is there any possibility of foreign control or of the supply chain being weaponized in that same way I just talked about for critical minerals? Is there a real area of concern here that we should be focused on from a national security perspective? Now, I do want to say that while national security is the focus, there have been numerous reports that have gone out and said, look, US industry has to be able to be in a position where it can supply the US military or the government in general if there's a real need, whether it be during a pandemic or otherwise. But to do so, they have to have necessary commercial volume. So for areas that are critical, the US government is really going to take a look and see, is there a possibility to reshore or friendshore a lot of these medical devices to see if we're able to help build out a more sustainable volume and path for US companies to be able to produce in the US and help keep the production here to have that capability in the US long term. Now, the last factor here, it just says any other relevant factor. As you probably can tell at this point, these factors are aimed at drawing comments more from US manufacturers than from people who are selling into the US market. The goal here is to try and get a sense of what are the challenges that the US industry is facing, both on the production side, but also I would say on the sales side in terms of what is the market structure, how are sales being done, things of that nature. So everyone is truly welcome to provide comments, regardless of whether they address any of the factors raised here or not. I would actually suggest that you do file comments, as I think this is likely going to be the one chance to really comment on this investigation. But you can also ask your congressional delegation to weigh in and provide letters later on as well. And again, the deadline for the comments is October 17th. That might change a little bit depending where things go with the government shutdown and when the government reopens. But that's more or less the key opportunity that there is here today. All right, so where do we see this going in terms of 6 months from now when the investigation is completed for the Section 232 on medical devices? Well, one area we can look at is what has happened in the past. And the most recent example would be the Section 301 tariffs on China, where last year there was a change to the tariff rate. So I have up here a chart. I'm not going to try and read it to you guys, but I think you can see that a bunch of things, whether it be gloves, syringes, masks, they all went from a tariff of either 0 or 7.5% up to 25, 50, or 100%. And I think you'll see with the second half of the table here, a lot of them are actually being phased in, right? The tariff started first in September 2024, but now a lot of it is actually going to step up to 50 or 100% on January 1st, 2026. And for syringes, an example, I think this is kind of a telling example. They're going to be at 100%. It's going to include not just basic syringes, but also these enteral syringes as well will now be included. So that's a strong push over time to help reshore US manufacturing there. And then on top of this all, we're already at 100% for syringes, and we've got the Section 232 coming, saying that, hey, maybe we should put more tariffs in place above 100% on syringes. And so I know PPE is not something that is considered part of telemedicine, but I do think it is kind of a really good example here. What's going on if syringes are already tariffed at 100%? Why do we need to tariff them more or have a higher rate of a tariff? And so I think more likely than not, what this kind of shows is syringes may have started coming in at actually a lower price in result of the tariff being in place at a set rate. If you think about it, it could be that it makes more sense to bring it in and declare it at a lower value. It also could just be that outright there is overproduction worldwide. And when there's a bunch of excess syringes that have to find a home, people are willing to sell them at much lower prices. The other thing I'd point out is, if you go back to 2018, when this trade war kind of first started with China, and it was just the Section 301 and the intellectual property theft, you can see the tariff rates were generally between 7.5% to 25%. And I think that's changed, and that reflects this ongoing shift in terms of the prices that are going in. It is that, excuse me, you see it increasing now where I'd say a lot of the Section 232s that we've seen recently have come in at a 25% rate to begin with. Steel and aluminum actually increased over the summer from 25 to 50. Copper showed up at 50%. Automobiles at 25%. Now, it's not to say that this is like going to be set in stone. The reciprocal tariffs, I'd say, are much more flexible, but the Section 232 tariffs do change over time. And we have seen them start to increase a little bit as the administration has decided there is a real need to address imports still coming in at too low prices. Now, again, Section 232, it's going to cover all of the imports from all countries. They're coming in at lower rates, sometimes based on trade deals that are negotiated. Autos was kind of a standout for that. Everyone got 25%, but Japan and the EU came in at about 15%. And then also, there isn't too much differentiation between either the reciprocal tariffs that we've seen right now or the Section 232 tariffs. If it's covered within the scope of the investigation, then generally that is the rate that is provided. Before, with that Section 301, it would be very specific. Depending on one HTS code versus another, you'd have it be 7.5% or you'd have it be 25%. It all kind of depended what it would be. And so a lot of companies started playing games where they would sometimes misclassify their products. So this time they're keeping it a lot cleaner, a lot simpler. There's no exemptions. Everything's kind of set at an equal rate, no distinction between different products or HTS codes. And on top of that, not only are they not going to do no exclusions, but now there's an inclusion process, flipping it on its head. So if they complete the investigation, typically what we're seeing is every 3 months, sometimes every 4 months, there will be a window for US companies to request for different products to be included and have the scope of the tariffs extended to include new different products. So just as an example for steel and aluminum, since that one's been around the longest, what we saw this past summer was a bunch of white goods, washing machines, garbage disposals. Those are mainly made out of steel and aluminum, and the tariffs were extended to cover those products completely with the 50% tariff. So in the years to come, yes, this medical device investigation, it's going to complete next spring. We don't know exactly when, but yes, there will be tariffs put in place at that point, and it will have a rate of X%, but that might change. It might increase over time. And then two, the scope of the investigation will be defined to cover all the different products, whether it be PPE, medical devices, or other medical equipment, right? But it also can extend over time. People may request at the inclusion process that other devices may be included more. Let's say, for example, crutches, for whatever reason, are not included initially. They might be included in a future round based on the inclusion process there. Now, what can you do if there's no US production? Well, right now, if goods are produced in the US, Mexico, or Canada, and are made with parts from the US, Mexico, or Canada, then they're considered to be compliant with the USMCA agreement. And anything that's compliant with USMCA, that's allowed duty-free trade between Canada, US, and Mexico. And that includes being exempt from these Section 232 tariffs, and also from the reciprocal tariffs by and large. Now, the USMCA agreement is up for renewal July 1, 2026. USTR has asked for comments from anyone who wants to comment on what the issues should or should not be included for renegotiation. And then last but not least, this is kind of a general observation. The reciprocal tariffs, have them up here on the board. You can see what the rates are at currently and how they've kind of moved around depending on different countries and areas and what trade deals have been struck or not struck. These are all based on trade negotiations. I would say that you can kind of tell a little bit that these are more flexible and are designed to be done on a country-specific basis for all goods, whereas the long-term goal is kind of to move it more towards Section 232, where it's more of a setup on an industry-specific basis after the Trump administration has really analyzed it and shifted to that. So looking at Brazil versus India, they both had a unexpected increase over the summer to 50%. But Brazil, they also started a companion Section 301 investigation for USTR. And so that kind of tells us that tariffs on Brazil, whatever rate they might wind up being, are more likely to stay in effect. Whereas for India, it's at 50%, but it's likely to still be negotiated and could possibly decrease over time. Now, I have up here the language from the reciprocal tariffs executive order. And just to zero in on it, if you go down to the bottom here, this is the description saying what will be exempt from the reciprocal tariffs. Anything that's covered by Section 232 is exempt from the reciprocal tariffs. So based on that, you can just see that over time, this is where things are going towards. The reciprocal tariffs, I'm not trying to say that they haven't had an influence and that they aren't important now. They absolutely are. And I think they're actually likely to stay around. But the Section 232, that's where things are going to be shifting. And it's going to be more of an industrial plan type of action in terms of saying, here are the tariffs, here are other incentives to re-incentivize US manufacturing, and help encourage people to move in that direction. So that's pretty much what I had right now. Lydia, was there any questions that anyone had about any of this?
Yeah, happy to open things up for questions from the audience.
Just want to say thank you. It was very informative.
Great. Yeah, hope it helps. Yeah, like I said, the interesting thing about the Section 232 investigations is they, right now at least, they tend to only provide one opportunity to comment, and it's very early on. And so while you have to do it in a little bit, it's so early that, like I said, things aren't well defined at this point. Given it is the main opportunity to get your voice heard, I do recommend putting in any sort of comments, even if it's suggesting that investigations focus on other areas.
Yeah, I work a lot with building offices here. I sit on committees for the hospital, and our cost for materials has made millions of dollars differences on these budgets, and some of them are being stalled at this moment.
Oh,
That's
absolutely. I mean, it is one of those things where, yes, if you're directly importing and you're the importer of record, sure, it has a direct impact on you. And yes, I understand telemedicine, it's more of an indirect impact, but to your example, I mean, it is a huge cost increase for hospitals right now to build out just on the steel and aluminum tariffs alone, let alone all the other things that have been going on.
What do you think is going to be like, and I know like this is just sort of a guess, but from a telemedicine perspective, you know, what do you think would be the biggest impact in this study? Is it the mobile devices? Is it, you know what I mean? Like when I'm thinking about it, there's peripherals, there's so many different ways. I think of the different types of services. You know, what do you think will have the most significant, like the thing, if you were worried about, what would you be worried about?
So I always worry about the things that I don't know about, and I think hospitals
Fair.
getting their budgets squeezed in some way, shape, or form would be something that would concern me. I also think that while there have been shortages of drugs, I think shortages of devices might be a new one that might be more problematic in the future or start to emerge. It's not to say that there isn't good manufacturing or significant supply in the US, but that when you have any sorts of transitions like we saw during the pandemic, it's going to pop up in weird ways, right? And
Sure.
there may be stockpiles, there may be sufficient inventory, but it's a little bit of a guessing game, and it depends on each individual market and company in terms of what they're able to move forward with, right? And so it's all fine and dandy until one day there's no hospital beds available for sale at any price.
Do you, when you had a slide that showed all the different countries and their tariffs, do you think there's one country that, like, I don't know, when I remember looking at it, I know China was higher and, you know, certain countries, yeah. It is one of the things that you would suggest thinking about is to be looking for options. I'm making it up, you know, have two different vendors, you know, because so much comes from China at this point, or even Korea, having, I'm making it up, Japan back up or UK back up.
Sure. So I think for a long time, people have pursued in the last 7, 8 years a China plus one strategy, right? China is still the main manufacturer for a lot of these goods, but it made sense to have a secondary manufacturer to have that extra reliability in the way that you're talking about. To the extent that it's possible, my recommendation would be to have that plus one be a US manufacturer at this point, particularly if you're going to be serving the US market. I think what we're going to see long term is the first order effect is, can you make it here in the US, right? And I think a lot of people have unused capacity that can be filled. But as that starts to happen and as that starts to take off, I suspect we're going to start seeing a lot more of the supply chain move away from Asia to North America in some way, shape, or form. Now, I think right now it makes a lot of sense to move it to Canada or Mexico along with the US, particularly for some of these parts, because you'll be able to still have duty-free treatment based under the USMCA agreement. Part of the uncertainty here is all of these agreements are being negotiated in different ways, but have yet to be finalized. And it's unclear until an agreement is really finalized and is a done deal, whether it will work or not. So just as an example, Japan was able to make an agreement to get a 15% tariff rate, and that was in exchange for having a pot of $550 billion being available for investing in the US. I don't know the exact details of it, but from what I've been able to read online, it looks like Korea was told, okay, Japan agreed to this deal, you should agree to the same deal, you know, adjusting a little bit for the size of your economies. And Korea has said, well, no, we don't really want to do that. Can we focus on other areas? Is there other things we can negotiate instead? So that's still under negotiation, and we'll see where that goes.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, no.
Looks like we have a question from Michelle.
Okay.
Have we identified any vendors in the market this will impact greater than others in telehealth?
No, so if you're asking, will it impact others? Not necessarily. So keep in mind, let's just say for the sake of argument that the Section 232 winds up being a 25% tariff. Well, if you're going to replace a 50% tariff on India right now with a Section 232 tariff of 25%, then that would actually kind of be a net positive for an Indian supplier. Conversely, if you have a company like Japan that's at 15%, but it's now increasing to 25% for telemedicine, well, that would shift it to be a little bit different, where they're disadvantaged compared to India in that example. The only ones that would really benefit would be companies that are manufacturing in the US or to a lesser extent, Canada or Mexico, because the tariffs do not impact them directly. I still think they will be impacted indirectly in a lot of different ways.
Let me follow up on that. This is Michelle. I asked the question because I was really looking for specifics around vendors that are already in the market that we might know have a large proliferation in this market that in fact manufacture in China or manufacture in India and will be majorly impacted, and therefore the downstream cost will be so high or higher.
Yes.
Have we, and it may not be you, and it may be CTEL, or maybe it's not even known, have we identified vendors that we know today? Yes, they're going to be impacted because 80% of their business is manufactured in China or what, that's what I'm kind of thinking about.
Gotcha. Yeah, I don't know that that's necessarily well known at this point. I would just say that this whole thing got kickstarted September 26th, so that would have been, what, 4 days ago? So it's a little early from last Friday till today to really know exactly who would be impacted the most. I think in general, though, it's fair to say that if there is production in China, by and large, it is likely to have some of the higher increased tariff costs. The other factor, which my apologies for not thinking to include it on this slide, is for a lot of these trade deals, and again, they're not a done deal yet, is President Trump has been insisting on including a circumvention clause. So if you have a good from China that is routed through Vietnam and then comes to the US, rather than qualifying for a lesser Vietnam rate of, say, 25%, instead you would be hit with a circumvention penalty and have to pay a 40% tariff rate instead. So in general, I do think that tariffs are going to become more important and more meaningful for manufacturers and for supply chains, if nothing else, because I think customs will be focused on enforcing the tariffs, given how much they are in the news right now.
I don't know if it's helpful for folks, but we do import from China, and Taiwan, which is a different tariff rate, and other countries. But I can tell you firsthand, and this is for blood pressure devices, scales, pulse oximeters, and glucose meters. And the existing tariffs, they do pose a significant challenge. We're a wholesaler, so we have been able to pass through the tariffs as a line item on our invoices to customers, where we eat a portion of it, but the majority of it is paid by our customers. They then pass on the cost, however they pass it on to keep their margins in line. But it's a challenge, and if they change again, we keep a very close eye on this. And thus far, the checks we've written to our customs broker, which essentially goes to the U.S. government, has reduced our profit margins by about 75%. And we have had to lay off 10% of our employees because of this. Now, we've been looking for a year, actually a year and a half, on how to build these things in the United States. And to your comments today, Milton, to build the stuff in the U.S. is tricky, because the parts are imported from, guess where? China, and Indonesia and other countries. So it's really hard to get around that. And approximately 60% of the parts components come from China and or Indonesia or Vietnam or someplace else that does have a high tariff rate. So when we pencil this out to spin up a manufacturing line in any one of the number of places we could do this in the United States, the cost ends up being 30 to 40% higher than the current cost of goods. So
Uh-huh.
it's somewhat of a wash, you know, it actually costs slightly more by building stuff domestically than building it overseas when you factor in the tariff amount.
Sure,
But
sure.
we're just we're a sample of one, but it is it's very, very challenging to pull this off. I can just share that with the group. It's a tricky challenge. And then you have to get FDA approval for your manufacturing facility,
Yep.
which
Yep.
is that going to take 6 months or 6 years? You know, who knows? So by the time you get all this done, it's really hard to make business decisions around this that make logical sense because there is a long planning cycle with these things.
There is, and just to add on to that, I would say it's the uncertainty of not just the tariffs, but also the FDA regulations or other registration that you need to stand up a new factory in the US that makes it very tough to figure out what is the right call for right now. The only thing I can share is that, look, we're approaching, I think, going on not quite 10 years, say 8 years of tariffs, both by the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and now the second Trump administration. So I'm not sure that tariffs are going to go away anytime soon. And that seems to suggest to me that even if it takes a long time to get through that FDA registration process, that starting to rebuild US manufacturing is where things are generally headed in the long run. I know that's kind of a wishy-washy answer, but I can't really tell you in the short run how things are going to zig or zag. There's just too much uncertainty there.
Yeah, yeah. Agreed.
Yeah, it is what it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say we have helped people kind of review their contracts, see if there's a way to add sort of, I don't want to call it a tariff surcharge, but try and create a flexible factor that says, this pricing is contingent based on the current tariff rate, and additional tariffs will be included as a separate line item should they change, that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Any other questions from folks? This recording, of course, will be available through your member portal. But thank you so much, Milton, for taking the time to speak about this issue with us. I think this, alongside the other trade issues that CTEL has taken a look at, are always an important discussion to have, especially as hospitals and practices face additional financial strains over the course of the past year. So with that, that's all that we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for presenting, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Lydia, and thank you, CTEL, for organizing this.
Thank you.